everyone. Good morning. As you can see, standing room only. Unsurprising, given our guest and given the topic under discussion. For those who don't know, I'm MISHA Glenny. I'm the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences, the IWM, here in Vienna, and we are the co-organizers, along with Time to Talk, of the Humanities Festival. When we were discussing who to invite to the Humanities Festival, we were still suffering under the shock of the events of February the 24th of this year, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we considered that come the autumn, we would perhaps like to have more considered understanding of the processes at work in Ukraine. And so we wanted to take deeper sort of historical look at the phenomenon at work here, which is war. And very conveniently, our guest this morning, Margaret Macmillan, has just published a book called War: How Conflict Shaped Us. Margaret is, I'm going to read this out because she's just done so much that unless I have a sort of precise version of her biog, we'll be here for the next hour. She's the Emeritus Professor of International History at University of Oxford, while simultaneously Professor of History at University of Toronto. She works, for those who don't know, at St. Anthony's College half the year these days, and half the year are in Toronto, right? And she is a best-selling and prize-winning author. Too many books to list here, but I am going to mention her international bestseller, Seize the Hour, When Nixon Met Mao. She's probably best known for her books about the First World War, the war that ended peace, the road to 1914, and Peacemakers, Paris 1919, the Paris Conference, which is regarded as the definitive history of 1919. It came out to absolutely rave reviews at the time. So much of the work that Margaret has done over her career so far has dealt with war. But I was interested, Margaret, that this book, the latest book, War: How Conflict Shaped Us, is, in contrast to your other books, it is not about an identifiable event around which you can consider all aspects of the subject. And so I wondered, from a purely writing point of view, from the author's perspective, how easy was it to grasp such an enormous subject, war, and then fashion a book around it without running into trouble?
Not very easy. But can I thank you first, and thank the Institute, and thank the Humanities Festival, because it's always a pleasure to come to Vienna, but particularly for something like this, which is just so interesting and stimulating. It was a subject that has run through my mind for a long time, and I've always been interested in war. I'm not sure why. And a lot of the work I've done involves war. I've written a lot about the First World War. I've taught history a lot over the years to various students, and I've actually taught courses on war and society. So when I was asked, the book grew out of lectures that I gave for the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. I was asked to do these lectures, and they said, nicely but terrifyingly, they said, you can do whatever you want them on, do whatever subject you want, which put me into a complete spin. But I then thought, well, war is something that runs like a thread through much of what I do, and perhaps I can look at different aspects of it. So it's not a history of war from beginning to end, although I use historical examples, but I was trying to look at the subjects that we find interesting about war. What is the experience like? Why do nations or groups of people go to war? What does it mean for those who fight? And as important, I think, what does it mean for civilians who so often, and we're seeing it yet again, get caught up through no will of their own in war? And other subjects sort of came up as I was doing it. How do we remember war? How do we commemorate it in the arts? So it was really a series of essays, but there were times when I thought, and I was finishing it during lockdown, there were times when I thought, this is, like, I can't do this. I don't, you know, I don't want to sit here and think about war. And I kept on thinking, you know, it's such a big subject. It's like having a sort of something that kept getting away from me. So I'd have to sort of pull it back and say, you know, I really cannot get into the bows and arrows of the Middle Ages too deeply, although I found them quite interesting. You know, and I can't really get into how they make cannon, although I found that quite interesting. So I had to keep reining myself back. But it was something that came out of, I think, you know, I'm quite old now, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. So it just was something, it came out of that.
So, for those who don't know, Margaret was referring to something called the Wreath Lectures, which is an annual set of lectures that goes on BBC Radio and is incredibly prestigious in the United Kingdom and indeed beyond. And I heard her lectures on war and thought that would make a good book, and I assumed you were probably working on it. But I guess that sense of being able to give lectures like that must have helped you structure the book in terms of which aspects to approach first and in what order.
I think it did, and also the places, because the BBC liked to do it in different places, and so we tried to tailor the lecture to the place. And so when I went to Belfast in Northern Ireland, the obvious subject seemed to be civil wars, which it was. And then when I went to Beirut, we went to Beirut for one of the lectures, and I thought, I'll do there what happens to civilians, because Beirut has been invaded so many times through history, and it's had so many sieges and so many civil wars. So that helped a bit. And what also I found helped a lot were the questions I got at the lectures. And so I added, the book has more subjects, more chapters than I had lectures, but because I got questions about, a lot of questions about women in war. You know, and I would get the question always, almost always, wouldn't the world be a safer and more peaceful place if women ran it? And I would say no. And then I'd just say, just think of Margaret Thatcher, Catherine the Great, Maria Theresa. You know, they presided over wars and they fought wars. And so I became, because of the questions, I became interested in gender and war. So giving lectures is very helpful because people ask questions which often you can't answer very well, and then you have to go away and think about them.
I think we might return a little later to that question of gender and war, and I'm interested to hear your initial response about Margaret Thatcher, Maria Theresa, and so on. But before we get there, slightly more generally, as I was reading it, I got the sense that obviously on so many levels you find war appalling for obvious reasons, but at the same time there was a recognition that war appears to be an integral part of human society, of the social and historical experience. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yes, it would. I think we have this hope, I think. Rousseau certainly had it, that if you go back far enough, we lived as pastoralists, we moved around with our flocks, animals, we were happy, we were anarchic, we didn't need much in the way of social control. I'm not sure that ever existed. If it did, we don't know enough, because we have only go on the written and archaeological records, and those written and archaeological records show that pretty much every people in every part of the world has used organized violence at certain times against other organized groups who are also using organized violence. And you know, once we begin to look at, as archaeologists are doing, ancient settlements, some of the earliest human settlements had walls around them. And you think, what were those walls for? Probably war. And so I think war runs through human society. And it's so much intertwined, I think you can't say one comes first. You know, there's one theory among ancient historians that perhaps war started when we settled down and became agriculturalists, because then it was harder to move and flee. And also you had more that people might want to come and take, but we don't know. But what I do think we know is that war and society are so intertwined that you can't really separate them. And so many of the social changes that have taken place, or the growth of big government, have been very much influenced by wars, the course of war. And so that's what I find interesting about it. And the other thing, I find it appalling. And when I wrote the book, I didn't think I'd ever be witnessing another major war, certainly not in Europe. You know, like everyone, I've been shocked and appalled by what's happened in Ukraine. But I think there's another side of war which is very uncomfortable for us, but I think we also find it fascinating. And in some cases, we find it attractive. You know, there are those who find war very appealing. And even those of us who don't, I think, look at the people who do things in war and think, how could they do it, whether for good or ill? I mean, war can bring out the best and the worst in human nature, and that's another side of it, which I think we have to confront.
Yes, again, something I want to discuss, that idea of heroism in particular, and how important that is in terms of fashioning social conscience. But you mentioned Rousseau there. In the book, you contrast Rousseau very quickly with Thomas Hobbes, yeah. And you seem to come out as a Hobbesian.
Probably. I mean, both Rousseau and Hobbes posited societies before recorded history, but I mean, they weren't actually saying we know these societies existed. They were putting them there as examples of what they were talking about. It was in a way to back up their arguments. And so Rousseau's argument was this state of happy cooperation without any need for strong organization or without any need for war. And Hobbes was this state of anarchy, which was human beings against human beings, man against man, as he put it, where life was nasty, brutish, and short. And it was impossible to have the development of the arts or science or industry because there wasn't time, because you were constantly at war. And I think both have something. I mean, Rousseau is arguing for a better vision of human nature, that we can actually overcome this.
It is appealing. It
is appealing, and I think we have to hope it. Hobbes is saying, wait a minute. But what Hobbes does do, I think, with his whole notion of Leviathan, this powerful government that develops, he says, and he would say, I think, if you're lucky, I don't want to put word, but if you're lucky, you get this powerful government which will have a monopoly of violence and will prevent the sort of low-level anarchy, which is so miserable for those who live through it. What he would say is that we have to accept that at some point you need force, and that somewhere behind any successful and stable society is that threat of force. I can see the argument that once we got strong central states like the Roman Empire, people within the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire wasn't kind and friendly to its subjects necessarily, and they used force if they ran into any dissent. But the Roman Empire provided people with stable lives, provided them the surety, it made trade possible. And I think what was very telling is that people moved into the Roman Empire, they didn't move out, because they were safer within. And I think those of us who live in very stable societies can take for granted stability and security, but we've seen what happens when societies don't have it. And so Hobbes, I think, hit on something, that how do we enforce the rules so that people can live with each other? And I hope we can do it through democracy, but even in democracies, we accept that government has a monopoly of force. It has police forces, it has military, it has law courts. Maybe it doesn't have to use them all that often, but we accept, I think. And war has had a lot to do with developing these strong central states.
That's the really interesting thing, is how you posit war as a trigger, a generator of positive social forces as well. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
This is something I get into trouble for, and people get very angry with me and say, you're saying war is a good thing, so you'd like a war. And I say, no, I'm not saying that. What I'm trying to say is that, like it or not, war can bring about changes which are beneficial in peacetime. And so the growth of the strong central state, whatever you may think of it, did bring about positive benefits and did make it possible for people to live together without not... You know, you can imagine what it was like living in the Middle Age, the sort of free-for-all of small duchy against small duchy, and you know, the people who tilled the fields and did the basic work was basically... You know, they weren't expendable, but they were simply told to do what they were told to do, and they were often handed off to one ruler or another without any consultation. And so you could argue that the growth of a strong central state has had positive benefits. And it has been argued, and I find these arguments compelling, by Thomas Piketty and Walter Scheidel, among others, that the two world wars, appalling though they were in their costs and their destruction, did lead to greater social equality. That in Western countries, and it was true of Japan as well, after the First and Second World Wars, there was greater social equality because the rich had been taxed. You know, during a war, the rich have to pay up. They can't move their money offshore because there's no longer the way of doing it, especially a major war. And the poor were better treated, those at the lower levels of society, because governments recognized it was necessary to feed them and house them and treat them and give them proper medical care. Otherwise, they wouldn't support the war effort.
So you have the Beveridge report in,
Exactly.
in the United Kingdom, which is being worked on long before the war actually ends,
Yes.
because the elite is anticipating that surge towards a more egalitarian society.
And I think the elite are also, at least the more enlightened members of the elite, are also saying we owe these people something. You know, they're the ones, you know, they suffered through the Blitz. They're the ones who worked in the factories. Britain could not have survived without them. So I think there's, you know, there's an anticipation of steering off trouble, but there's also a sense that they're owed this. And we also know that war can stimulate medical advances. Again, we wouldn't choose to do it that way, but I compare it sometimes. I mean, the COVID pandemic was not a war, although language of war was used, but we did things during the pandemic which we probably should have done before, but sometimes it takes a great crisis for us to do the things we should have done.
You mentioned the Middle Ages and that sort of, you know, anarchic state of duchy against duchy, and who knows who's going to come through your territory at any one minute, and what they're going to do. I suppose the apotheosis of that was the 30 Years' War, where an entire swathe of the European continent is suddenly ripped apart by marauding mercenary armies. That must have shocked Europe in a way that few other conflicts have. Did it lead to a change in the nature of warfare?
The changes were already happening. I mean, part of the reason the war was so vicious was the weapons were getting better. They now had guns, they now had muskets, they now had much better cannon. It was also a war on different levels. It reminds me a bit of the war in Afghanistan or Syria today, where you have wars between states. You also have outside powers meddling and backing one state against another. You also had social upheavals. You also had ideological changes, because these were wars in which the 30 Years' War was a war in which religion played a part. But there were also civil wars. There were uprisings of peasants or uprisings of artisans. So it was a war on many levels. Plus you had a lot of people, you know, people will come into wars because they'll get something out of it. And so what you had in Europe in the 17th century and what you have in Syria and you had in Afghanistan were the mercenaries, the looters, the people who simply saw they could get something out of it. You know, the Swedes, who we now think of as eminently peaceful, walking in the woods, picking up mushrooms, eating granola, were absolutely vicious. I mean, you know, they were among the most brutal and rapacious of all the armies coming in to this ghastly conflict. You know, I've read books on the 30 Years' War, but if I had to do an examination on it, I'd fail every time because they kept changing sides too.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, and all the rulers were called Karl or Henry, or you know, there were about 4 names. Otto, I think.
And but ironically, I suppose, of course, Sweden's transformation into the sort of happy mushroom pickers was the result of the catastrophic defeats in the Great Northern War.
I think it had a lot to do with it, and it gives me some hope that societies do change. I mean, Sweden was a heavily militarized society and very hierarchical, and that did change, and it was enormously successful. It was a real power, but gradually it was fought back, and Poltava was very important, which Putin, of course, refers to a lot, as he refers to the great Russian victories of the past, when the armies of the Swedish armies were defeated, and Russia became the major northern power. So, you know, Sweden has changed enormously. It became a social democratic society. And you think of Germany, much closer at hand, where you had, certainly not all of Germany, but in Prussia, you had this domination by the Junker class of the institutions of the state and the bureaucracy and, of course, the military. And that's gone. You know, that militarized culture, which was a model for so many in Germany, has more or less vanished.
That's important. We'll come back to that when we talk about the Russia-Ukrainian war. But I got the impression from reading the book that you almost think that between, say, the beginning of the 18th, end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, this is in Europe, of course, I'm referring to, and I'm afraid we're being very Eurocentric at the moment, which I hope we'll move away from at some point, until the Napoleonic Wars, that that long 18th century, as it were, was quite a sort of polite, gentlemanly way of waging war, or at least that's the impression I got from...
It was more, it was what Bismarck and Metternich called cabinet wars. And so these were wars made by states. Louis XIV, of course, was responsible for a lot of the wars, made by a very few number of people for their own purposes. And they more or less obeyed the rules. And they more or less had rules about once you'd occupied a piece of land, when you had a peace treaty, you'd sit down and negotiate it. And you didn't get the all-out total wars, and nor did most of the rulers in Europe want to use ordinary people. They didn't want their useful farmers going off to war because they were much better off from the point of view of the rulers tilling the fields. And so what they tended to do was have mercenaries. They'd hire people from the poorest parts of Europe, Scots, like some of my ancestors, Irish, Swiss. These were poor parts of the world, parts of Poland. So they used mercenaries, or they used people very much like Putin is doing today, people who they thought were expendable. If you were sentenced to death for a crime in Britain, in England, and there were many things you could be sentenced to death for, I mean, stealing a pair of shoes was a capital crime, you were often given the choice, if you were a man, of being executed or going into the army, because you were considered so expendable. They wanted cannon fodder, and they trained them very hard, and they used them. But so I think we look back at the wars after this 30 Years' War and the wars of the 18th century as somehow more moderate and limited. And the goals were more limited. And I would argue that by the time, when we get to the 19th century and we get the growth of nationalism, then the goals become much wider.
But also, you point out in the book that it is the Napoleonic mobilization that changes things very dramatically.
Yeah. There's a very important moment, I think, and nationalism is growing anyway. I mean, we forget how new it is. We tend to, because people who are nationalists always talk about the enduring nation and go back into, it's very convenient when people talk about the mists of time, they can't prove it, but it's a convenient fog back there where they'll say, there's always been a German nation, there's always been a French nation, there's always been an English nation. The historical evidence is often very bad for that. But what you do get in the late 18th century, and certainly the 19th century, is this development of the idea of the nation, this sort of eternal body, which has many features actually of a religion. It precedes you, it will outlast you, you're only part of it. And so dying for this thing, in a way, is getting a sense of immortality. And I think what the French Revolution does, and the American War of Independence, and the Swedes actually do it a bit, is you begin to get a transformation of people from being, and this is men, of course, at this point, from being subjects into citizens. If you're a subject, you do what you're told, and you don't have any say in your own government. It is fixed by hierarchy, by descendants, by legitimacy, whatever. If you're a citizen, you actually participate in your own government, but you have a corresponding obligation to defend it. And there's this famous levée en masse that was announced in France in 1792 when the forces of the conservative states were gathering against the French revolutionary forces, which is every man must be prepared to fight. Men who are too old will have themselves carried into the squares and inspire the young. Women will make bandages. Children will do their bit. We need you all. And that makes the wars much more passionate. And it's now, it takes a while to happen, but what the French do is they overrun Europe because they have partly the biggest economy and they have a big population, and they have Napoleon, who was a military genius. And what they do actually is create similar feelings in other people. The Prussians begin to respond to this, saying, actually, we don't want to be told how to behave by the French. We don't believe their revolution is universal. And so the 19th century becomes an age of nationalisms in Europe, and that spreads. It spreads further afield. It's moving around the world. And I had thought that this sort of nationalism was dead, and here we are with it again today.
And you point out that that way of organizing war with integrating all aspects of society into war it results in a huge change of scale.
Yeah.
That up until then, it was manageable, comprehensible. Now all of society is involved, both as participants, but also as potential victims.
Well, it coincides, and so often coincidence matters in history, it coincides with the Industrial Revolution. So there were natural limits on the size of armies before the Industrial Revolution. You could have all sorts of enthusiastic volunteers, but you couldn't supply them. To make one musket took a gunsmith, 2 weeks. Once you get industrial production, interchangeable parts. You can pour the materials out. Transportation. I mean, armies in the past were like locusts. I mean, they'd hit a certain neighborhood, and they could stay there as long as they had enough to eat. But they'd eat everything out in the neighborhood. They'd have to move on. And so you couldn't have armies beyond a certain size, and you couldn't keep them in the field all that long because you just simply couldn't get the materials they needed or the food to them. What the Industrial Revolution did, and this is why the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, the American Civil War become so big, is because it's possible now. And you can keep supplying them if you have the railways in the right position or the steamships in the right position, which is why wars that would last maybe 2 weeks now can last for 4 years. And they can take place on a scale which is unimaginable to people before. You just couldn't have armies beyond a certain size because there were natural limits on them.
Yes, I remember when I was doing some research on the Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913, that all the major arms manufacturers in Europe, Skoda, Vickers, Le Creuset, Krupp, they all sent observers down to the war in order to see A, how their equipment was working, but B, how they could improve it and how they could make it more destructive.
Yeah. Well, the destructive power of the weapons is enormous. I mean, the average range of an infantry musket, and these were the ones you had to load standing up, so you were vulnerable while you were loading them, was, I think, 100 yards. In meters, would be 30 meters at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. By the end of the 19th century, it was 1,000 yards, or if someone can put that into... Anyway, it's 10 times as much, plus they're much more accurate, because they're rifled, and so that makes the bullet fly a lot more accurately, and you can load them lying down, and you can use magazines, so you often have repeating rifles where you can fire, and then, of course, you have machine guns. And so the weight of the armaments and the potential for killing, as the armies get bigger, so does the potential for killing more of them.
And the Air Force comes into play, and so that means that the home fires are not just caused by people cooking, they're also caused by bombs.
Yeah. Well, there had always been limits, again, on how much you could get at civilians. You could get at them. What they did in the Middle Ages, for example, is they would lay waste. If you were besieging someone's castle, you would sometimes lay waste to all the farms outside, killing the people, of course, or animals, driving them off. And that was a way of forcing those inside to surrender. It was called a chevauchée. You'd just destroy everything as an example of what might happen. Or you would besiege cities, and civilians would often pay a heavy price. Or the British would use the naval blockade. They'd prevent goods getting into ports. But the ways of getting at civilians were fairly limited. And what happened with the result of the airplane, and submarines made a huge difference as well, the airplane made it possible to get behind the enemy lines at the civilians, and because increasing the line between civilians and soldiers was blurred, because if the soldiers had been kept in the field by all those civilians working in factories, and by the whole infrastructure behind, then it becomes, and people resisted it, became a legitimate target of war. And now I think the line we've seen in Ukraine, the line between the battlefront and the home front is pretty much non-existent.
So in the space of about 50 years, I think air power was first deployed against Libya by Italy in, was it 1908 or 1907? Or 1910 even, around then.
Yeah.
That was the first time it was used. In the space of 50 years, we go from that...
to the atomic bomb.
To the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just off the scale in terms of how technology alters our entire perception of war.
And it's happening more quickly. You know, it's speeded up. If you look at pictures of aircraft at the beginning of the First World War, they're little tiny flimsy things made out of toothpicks practically with little bits of canvas. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but one engine. By the end of the war, they've got 2 engine planes. They're armed. They can drop bombs. They're much more powerful. They can fly further. And, of course, the Second World War brings the jet engine and the long-range bombers. So it becomes, it becomes much more possible. And, again, it becomes permissible. I mean, there's still inhibitions and there's still rules against attacking civilians, but it's very easy to ignore those in war.
Yeah. And there was Dresden as well, of course. There was all that. There was the mass civilian bombings from both sides. But now we get. Before I throw it, the time is going so quickly. Oh no, I've got slightly more time than I thought because I wanted to ask about the gender question first. And do you think would you argue that the introduction of women into war as a, you know, as a labor force and then later on even as combat force is changing the nature of war, or what are the dynamics on the gender question?
Funnily, you know, it's one of those subjects which I think is very important, and it's not studied enough. And I'm not sure why. You know, there may be one feminist historian has argued, an American feminist historian has argued that women historians, particularly if they're strong feminists, which most of us are, don't like to study women in war because they find war, they see it as a masculine subject and something that men do, I think. But there's surprisingly little written and researched, and surprisingly little research done on women in war. I mean, what has been happening is that in a number of armies, a number of armed forces had women, but as support. So they did this, they drove trucks, they would fly airplanes, but only to deliver them. The Israelis, for example, who conscripted women as much as men, if you actually looked at where the women were, they were usually not on the front lines. And, you know, and elite units of the army, like the tank regiments, I think were almost entirely men. What has been happening in the last few years is that in certain armies and certain armed forces, women have been playing combat roles. And this has caused, I think, problems. There's been pushback from the men who've said, you know, it's weakening our unity, it's weakening our morale. There was a wonderful article I read where a Marine said this was in the US, said, you know, he said, I used to be with the guys together and I could behave badly and I could belch and fart and behave, and now you have women there and I can't be the same. And he said, it's not fun anymore. So, you know, you get these sort of, you know, we live in this masculine world and here come the women. What's also happened, and it's something that the military are having real trouble with, and there's more sexual harassment. You know, there's always been sexual harassment among military and of civilians, but you know, and same-sex relationships in the military, which have sometimes caused tensions and difficulties, especially if they go across ranks. But there are now, I think, there's a real sort of unspoken problem. They don't like to talk about it, but there is a problem with sexual harassment, and you know, there's you know, a lot of military have traditionally stressed what we think of as masculine values and a type of masculinity. And it's hard for them to adjust, I think. And this is something, as I say, the military are grappling with, but they're finding it an uncomfortable thing to talk about. But as far as we can tell, I mean, there are all sorts of arguments about this, about you know, how much of the gender difference is biological and how much is cultural. And for most of recorded human history in any part of the world, 99.9% of those who fought have been men. Is that cultural or biological? I don't think we know. The evidence is that women can take on combat roles and perform as well as badly or as badly as men. Svetlana Alexievich wrote, I think she's a wonderful writer, but one of her wonderful books is The Unwomanly Face of War, in which she talks about Soviet women in the Second World War. And they were snipers, and they were fighter pilots, and they were bomber pilots. And they fought, you know, in the same circumstances that the men did, and fought as bravely or as not as the men did.
Now, we had this period from 1945 to 1991, where in Europe and the United States, we lost the experience of war on our territories. There were, of course, wars going on all over the world at the time, often with very active participation of the United States or some West European countries, and similarly, the Soviet experience was the same. They were fighting proxy wars as well. Many of these wars were civil wars, perhaps with an ideological, perhaps with a national identity issue. First of all, can you give us a sense of what the difference between a civil war is and a conventional war? And secondly, was this absence of war in our lives, did it result in a certain complacency that we are now having to regret, in a sense, that we simply don't know how to deal with war anymore?
I know, well, the Civil War versus other kinds of wars, let me deal with that one first. I mean, conventional war can be as passionate and as dreadful as civil war. I mean, the worst wars, I think, are when people are fighting as what they see as an existential threat. In the First World War, the French and the Germans, or the Germans and the Russians, felt they were fighting for the survival of the race, as they would have put it then. And that means that whatever you do to the other side is justified because they're trying to do it to you. So that total war can bring out these passions, and has done, and even smaller wars can do it. Whereas civil war is different, and perhaps gets even more passionate and bloodthirsty, if that's possible, is that you're fighting over the same thing. You're fighting over the same piece of territory. You're fighting over different visions of what should exist on that territory. It's a family fight. And it's often even the more bitter because you feel such a sense of betrayal. I mean, it's one thing to say those people on the other side of the Rhine have always been they're not like us, they've always been our enemies, which was said a lot before the First World War between the French and the Germans. But with a civil war, it's a family war, and they're betraying you by being on the other side. And so I think civil wars are even more intractable in a way, and can be even bloodier than the wars that take place between states. Because at a certain point in a war between states, both states will come to there will either be complete victory of one over the other, or both sides will say, there's no point in fighting anymore, we've got to make peace. Civil war, you're fighting for a vision of the society you want to live in, and you want to dominate it. So I think it could be even worse. Sorry, I've now forgotten that.
The second one is about the absence of war in Europe and the United States over that extended period. We became very smug and complacent, and I include myself. I'm Canadian, and we sent troops to fight in other parts of the world, but it never affected us. And because most of the countries sending off troops to fight in wars around the world didn't have conscription, they increasingly drew, as they drew today, on very small sectors of the population. I mean, a great many of those who go into the armed forces in Canada come from rural areas, or they come from families which have a tradition of service in the armed forces. The same is very much true in the United States. And it's often particular sectors of societies, often immigrants, for example, who in some countries, like the US, will be given a fast track to citizenship if they join the armed forces. And so for most people, they won't meet anyone who's fought in a war, and the war is something that happens very far away. And it's not unlike what was happening in Europe before 1914, where wars were colonial wars, and there was an assumption, well, those people over there do it because they're less civilized than us. Even the wars in the Balkans in 1912 and 1913, the Carnegie Institute did a report on it and said, well, these aren't civilized like Europe. Nothing like this could ever happen in Europe. The report came out just after the First World War started, and yes, it did happen. But I think we thought that war is not something we do anymore, and it's only those people over there, and occasionally we have to intervene because they can't sort it out for themselves. And that, I think, has been very dangerous. And I think it's been dangerous because the publics haven't paid much attention. I think it's also been dangerous for our political leadership, because there are very few political leaders around in Western countries now who've had any experience of war. Up until, I think George Bush Jr. George Bush Jr. avoided war. He was in a pickup truck in Texas, but during the Vietnam War. George Bush Sr. had been in war. Clinton certainly hadn't been. I think George Bush Sr., was the last president who'd experienced war. And it's often the case that those who've experienced war are much more reluctant to go to war. General Eisenhower became President Eisenhower. He didn't want the US in wars. He was very, very reluctant to see it. And I think you get these hawkish civilians who will talk about, it's going to be so easy. That's what they thought in Iraq. We're so powerful, we'll send it in quick and easy. They'll do what we tell them. And they make a much worse mess, funnily enough, I think, than people who know what war's like. Yep, and we're seeing the same phenomenon now in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Just before I hand it over to the audience, this issue of the Russian invasion and occupation of part of the Ukrainian territory. So it strikes me that whether Putin is delusional, unhinged, or merely greedy, whatever it is, we're dealing with a conflict which is qualitatively different because Russia possesses almost half the stock of the globe's nuclear weapons. And so regardless of how incompetent the Russian army has turned out to be, how brutal it's turned out to be. In your experience of looking at wars, escalation, and so on, how dangerous does the Russian invasion of Ukraine strike you now, 6 or 7 months after?
Very dangerous. Whether it's more or less dangerous than when it started, I don't know. Because wars always take on their own momentum. You know, Clausewitz said it very well. He said wars have their own logic. And once you start a war, it's very difficult to end it. You know, and too often nations or groups of people start wars without thinking how they're going to end it. And I think, well, Putin's idea, as we heard from Catherine Belton yesterday, was that he was going to end it probably in 2 days. He had apparently a puppet government ready in his baggage train. And you've probably all heard reports of the Ukrainians finding Russian army officers' luggage with their dress uniforms in it for the victory parade, which was about to happen in Kiev. And so I think, you know, wars take on their own momentum, and the more you lose, and I think that's what helped to keep the First World War going, was the more difficult it is to back out. I mean, how does Putin back out now, having faced humiliation after humiliation, including a fresh one this morning, reported this morning, and I'm not pronouncing, is it Liman or
Liman?
Liman. The Russians are regrouping, which means they're retreating, if they can retreat. I mean, you know, I think he's going to lose a lot of troops there. And so it is worrying. I mean, on the other side, what do you actually do with nuclear weapons? You know, they talk about tactical and strategic. Basically, if you use a nuclear weapon of whatever size, you've broken a barrier, and all bets are off. So what does he do? Does he drop it on Kyiv, which he says is the birthplace of the Russian people? You know, you know, or does he? There's been talk of doing a demonstration. Does he drop it on Snake Island? Does he bomb Warsaw? That would be madness, I think. You know, to do anything outside. But you know, what does he actually do with it? And I suppose the other thing we have to hope is, as increasing signs appear, and again, Catherine Belton was so interesting on this, increasing signs of dissent appear among the Russian elite. What do his generals actually do if he orders them to do it? I mean, they want to save their skins at some point. Do they actually want to go down in a nuclear holocaust? I'm not saying it's not dangerous, but I'm hoping that, you know, there may be countervailing constraints. Yeah. But I think we have no influence over what happens. I think we just have to watch and see. And it is very, very worrying, I think.
Well, on that not wildly optimistic note, I'm going to throw it open to the audience. I see a hand at the back there.
Hello there, Ms. Macmillan. Thank you very much. It was a great lecture. And I want to take you back to the penultimate question of Misha about the, are people becoming more complacent about war now that we haven't seen it in quite a few decades in Europe? And my thought is on the effects of social media, because probably more than ever now, the Ukrainian war has been like televised on various channels that are not like your normal channels that used to be, you know, even they're not on the internet per se, like only on the internet. They're on Telegram channels. They're on various like sub platforms and so on. Can I hear your thoughts about first of all, like how would this affect historical thinking about war from now on? If all of the wars that we'll be seeing from now on would be with competing narratives on different channels, how are you going to study it from now on, or your the next historians coming in? And the other part is like, do you think that you know, these sorts of social media wars are getting people more hyped up about war and more ready to support war as a propaganda effort, or would be having the opposite effect? I mean, I guess it's both ways, but which do you think will prevail? Thank you.
Well, let me do the complacency one very quickly. I think we were complacent. I think we're much less complacent now, and I suspect those of you who live closer to what's happening in Ukraine are even less complacent than perhaps people like me in Canada. Every war will use the technology that exists and in society, and will often use it in unexpected ways. And I think we've all been surprised by the ways in which social media has played such an important part. I mean, important for intelligence gathering, too. You know, the ways in which Ukrainians, ordinary citizens, have used their phones to pinpoint where the Russian forces are and to send that information back. In most wars, I would say there's, even in the past, there have been competing narratives. And one of the things you want to do in a war is persuade your own people they should keep fighting, and often persuade the enemy they should stop. How you do that depends, of course, very much on what technology is available. And so in the 18th century, they would make prints, which would be distributed all over Europe. Napoleon had himself painted in a variety of heroic poses, and many copies were made of those, and prints were made of them. By the 20th century, in the First World War, they dropped leaflets on each other, or they fired leaflets across the borders, but they also, increasingly, governments controlled what people at home would get. They called it in a rather sinister way ministries of information. It was basically ministries of propaganda and keeping control of the news. The First World War also began to see the use of film and photography. And in the Second World War, of course, radio and film was also very important. Vietnam War, television was important. So I think we're now seeing the incorporation of social media into war in a number of ways. And I think from now on, I mean, we were already seeing this, who gets their story out, how much disinformation or misinformation they can spread is going to matter. But also, I think what you're doing in war, you're trying to rally your own people, you're trying to demoralize the enemy, you're also trying to persuade neutrals or bystanders they should be on your side and not on the other side. And I think Ukraine, on all those three, has won hands down over Russia. You know, they've been brilliant in phoning up Russian soldiers' families and saying, we have your son captured, but don't worry, he's okay. I mean, just a simple thing like that is absolutely brilliant. But they've also been, I mean, Zelensky has turned out to be absolutely a master at this. I mean, he's talked to the world, and he's constantly talking to parliaments around the world, to the UN General Assembly. And so I think that's been very important. And he's also managed, I think, to rally the Ukrainian people, because he's addressed them. I think he talks to them pretty much every day. Rather like Winston Churchill did in the Second World War, he doesn't try and make things look better than they are, which I think in the long run is a very good tactic. So yes, I think social media will continue to be enormously important in any future war. It was already becoming very important in undeclared wars, wars that weren't shooting wars, and I think, yes, it's going to be much more important.
I think it's worth adding on, and to the Zelensky's ability is, of course, he was a television actor in that hyper-ironic series about becoming a president. That he brought with him wholesale all his scriptwriters from the TV show to be his presidential writers. And actually why that's important is because, of course, most people absorb, a lot of people absorb their knowledge from television drama these days and film. And so he would identify what his audience is each time, and the scriptwriters would write a script for that audience. Really, really smart stuff.
Well, even the image, I think, is so interesting, because when you compare him to Putin, you know, Zelensky looks like a vigorous young man. He's wearing a T-shirt. He talks in this informal way. And then you see this, as Navalny calls him, grandpa, sitting at the end of this enormous table, looking sort of scared. The visual is so different.
I know, and it's strange that, you know, that I wonder what Russians feel like when they see that, you know, absurdly distant character who often, whenever he's talking to people, he's incredibly dismissive and unpleasant. Now, maybe that's the desire for a stern father figure, but I just don't think that in this day and age that's a particularly attractive feature.
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry, I see a hand there and then there. So take that one first by the wall, representing the standing room only people.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for this discussion and presentation. One of the first speakers at this festival here in Vienna was the economist Joseph Stiglitz. He was saying that that the West is very good since World War II at pretending that they are not at war when they actually are at war. That we are at war, but we're pretending that we're not. We're using market mechanisms to sort of tinker with inflation instead of admitting that we are at war and then using governmental powers to really tackle the challenges that this war is facing upon us. As a historian who's, I suppose, knows a lot about the long peace of the 19th century and these colonial wars in faraway places, do you think that we truly are at war in a more literal sense than just war in Europe or war in the West, and that we should admit it and should take a different attitude towards also tackling the challenges that we face because of this?
What I find is the metaphor of war gets used a lot. And so we talk about wars on poverty, we talk about wars on inflation, we talk about wars on obesity, for example. And I always think we should restrict, when we're really talking about war, we should restrict it to organized violence by an organized group with a political goal. And I suppose you could argue the West has had a series of enemies, or been preparing for a series of enemies, but we haven't had one enemy since the end of the Cold War. We've had a series of different ones. So are we at war? Well, we are involved in a number of wars, but are we in a major conflict? Not yet, I don't think so. We're using, what we have done is use all sorts of, and we can argue about whether the terminology is right, but it seems to me that we haven't yet, Western countries have not yet committed their troops, and they never did during the Soviets and the Americans never fought each other. NATO and the Warsaw Pact never fought each other directly, so they fought indirectly. You could argue that is war by indirect means, but it's not the sort of conflict I think of as war where the two protagonists are engaged with each other. But there's always that possibility. And at the moment, what we're seeing in Ukraine is a war by proxy, with one side engaged and the other side supporting. Its proxy is perhaps an insulting word to use to the Ukrainians, but supporting its chosen people. But we aren't engaged yet, I think, in a full-scale war. But it may mean that we have to take some of the measures that we would take during a war, that the government may, this winter, governments may have to intervene much more than they had thought likely, and I think it's looking more and more likely to happen, that governments will have to intervene in the energy markets, have to intervene to make sure that the economies keep going, and that those who are suffering really because those who are finding the burden of increased energy bills unbearable have got to be supported. And governments, I think, increasingly are taking measures to find alternative sorts of energy. The trouble with that, it's not going to come on tap right away. But I think we may well have to take the sorts of measures that you take in wartime, which we don't usually take in peacetime. But we know that can happen. Governments did it during COVID. There are times, they did it during the financial crisis of 2008. There are times when governments will intervene very seriously to keep the show on the road. And I think they may well find themselves doing it this winter. So it will be warlike in that.
So with the signal exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually the Russia-Ukrainian war, we are closer to the possibility of a clash between Russia and the United States and the West than we have ever been, really.
We were close, I suppose, in the Korean War. But then the Americans fought the Chinese. The Russians very carefully pulled back, which is one of the things Mao never forgave Stalin for. He said Stalin landed a bit and then didn't do anything. So yeah, I mean, it's always dangerous when one side is actually there on the ground. Yeah. And it's so close to NATO. I mean, the other wars in the Cold War, they were fought far away from the alliances themselves. Yeah. And now, with the exception, as you say, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah.
There was a question at the back there.
Thank you, Professor Macmillan. I'm Alexandra Dinas. I work for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and I would like to know, what do you think we can learn from the experience of both world wars for what's going on now in Russia's war against Ukraine, and how you think it's likely to end?
Well, yes, I think it is such an important question, and the First World War ended in the end with a combination of military defeat of the Central Powers, although Germany later came on to argue that it never had been defeated on the battlefields. In fact, it was defeated. But also, the Central Powers just fell to pieces. Russia had dropped out of the war, leaving Austria-Hungary, I suppose, victor in the East, but Austria-Hungary was in the process of disintegrating. Bulgaria was pulling away. Turkey was in the process of collapsing. And so the First World War ended with attrition, partly, but also with military defeat on the battlefields. And the Second World War ended, again, with that combination. I mean, in the end, Germany, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, and their lesser allies, simply could not keep up with Western production and did not have the manpower, in the end, that the Soviet Union could bring into it. So it was a combination of attrition, but it was also military defeat. And what was striking in the Second World War, and it was a lesson that Roosevelt, the American president, as others drew from the First World War, is at this time those who are defeated must know it, which is why Germany was occupied, why Japan was occupied. There was to be no doubt about it. Now, we can't imagine that sort of end, I think, for this current war. I mean, it would be unthinkable, I think, that the Western powers would even contemplate occupying Russia. I mean, that would be madness. So at what point is it possible for the West to make an offer to Russia that Russia might want to accept? It's going to be complicated because Ukraine will have its own voice. I mean, it's Ukraine that is doing the fighting, and Ukrainians are doing the dying on the battlefields. And I can't see anytime soon them wanting to say to the Russians, okay, you keep a big chunk of the East and you keep Crimea and we'll forget about all the damage you've done, let's just get on with it. At the moment, I think that's highly unlikely. Will the Russians admit defeat, which is what's happening to them on the battlefield? And again, not yet. And I think it depends, of course, on Putin. I mean, this is, people say the great man theory of history is nonsense. Well, I don't think there would have been a war without Putin. It's Putin's war. At what point will he try and get some sort of deal? I don't know. And then there are all the other players. How much leverage can China exert over Russia? The Chinese are obviously not pleased with what's happening. They have backed the wrong party in this particular dispute. At what point can outside powers come together? There's so many moving parts, and I think a lot of it's going to be settled on the battlefield, and that's outside of the control of anyone except those who are supplying the Ukrainians. I mean, I suppose the West could put pressure on the Ukrainians and say, look, we're not giving you anything more unless you come to peace terms. That's highly unlikely at the moment. It may be what Putin is hoping. I mean, his latest speech, I mean, he has this vision, which he hasn't yet abandoned, of the West being decadent, hopeless, deeply divided. It's not capable of sustaining a long war. He is probably wrong on that, but he will be encouraged by the results of the election in Italy, and he will be encouraged by public concern during the winter over fuel issues. So he may be hoping the West simply doesn't have the stamina to keep going. But at the moment, and I'm hoping I'm wrong, but at the moment I don't see any possibility of negotiations. I mean, there haven't been, there were those attempts at negotiations in Turkey, and they have not been resumed. And whatever outsiders want at the moment, I think a lot of it is out of our control. Sorry, not a rather depressing answer, but...
Time for one more question. Sir.
Well, may I talk? Thank you for your presentation and the conversation. It's been great to listen to it. You mentioned the Junker class in the Prussia and its disappearance. At least that's what I understand. Do you see any parallels, or can you draw any parallels between that class and the aggressive, imperialistic focus around the FSB company that is running Russia today? Yeah. And how would we get them out? Because I understand it that while they're there, no matter what happens at the end of this war, they're going to remain aggressive and imperialistic.
Yes, I was struck by your examples of Sweden and Germany, and how societal attitudes and historical traditions do change through war. Yeah. Is it possible in this case?
Yeah. I guess I don't know enough about it, and I'd love to hear what Catherine Belton could say about it, for example, about the ethos of this particular group. I mean, they're apparatchiks. They came out of a Soviet system where you became part of the system, you professed to believe in communism even if you didn't, because that was the way to get ahead, and you looked after yourself. And in the collapse of the Soviet Union, this group, who are no fools, I mean, they're self-interested, managed to get their hands on the levers of an awful lot of the wealth of the Russian state. And they have done very well for themselves. But what ethos binds them together beyond self-preservation and wanting to look out for their ill-got gains and protect their families and possibly those who they have in patronage networks. I mean, what the difference was, I think, with the Swedes and with the ancient Spartans and with the Junkers was that they had a set of values. They had an identity beyond their own particular existence. They belonged to a class which had very clearly stated values. And we don't have to agree with those values, but the values in the case of the Junkers were bravery, prepared to die for king and country, prepared to sacrifice, prepared to take orders. Do we know? I don't know enough about the sorts of people now who occupy the high positions in Russia. And what strikes me about them is they seem to be motivated entirely by self-preservation, perhaps a sense of rebuilding some Russian glory. But perhaps one difference among them is that I don't see, as far as the evidence goes, many of them or their sons going off to fight in Ukraine. Whereas you would get, I mean, the Junker families, their sons went to fight. The Spartan upper classes went to fight. I mean, that was part of what you did. It was that very telling moment when Putin announced his conscription, and some prankster, I thought very intelligent, phoned up the son of one of the top officials in the Putin government and said, "You've just been conscripted." And there was a silence, and this young man said, "Oh, I'll take that up at a higher level." "No, I haven't been." So it's a very different sort of class. I mean, my sense is that given a chance, they'll scuttle. You know, if they could scuttle off to their yachts or to their villas, a lot of them would be going. It's just that they can't get out. So I don't think, and I may be wrong, and I'd love to know more about it, but I don't see them as a class that is, has any sort of identity beyond themselves, any set of values which they might adhere to. I don't know. You probably know more, but...
But it's not my place to say anything here,
Okay.
other than to use this opportunity. This hasn't been the chirpiest conversation for a midday on a Sunday, but it's been extremely illuminating, so I want to end on some good news. And that is, Margaret has kindly agreed to sign her books after this for half an hour. So I suggest you all go out and buy one while you still can, because there'll be a big run on them. Margaret Macmillan, thank you very much indeed.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very nice. Thank you.